So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce the speakers for today's event. Because artists working with machine learning is such an emerging discipline. It's really exciting that we're able to showcase this practice at Tinderbox Playaway. And I also don't think there are two people that have been more influential in making this practice accessible than the two people I'm pleased to introduce to you, Derrick Schultz and Lia Coleman. So many of you may be familiar with their work, but for those of you who aren't, artificial images is the art practice of Derrick Schultz. So utilizing cutting-edge machine learning technology, his work explores multi-sensory perception, generative abstraction, and the future of ecology. Lia Coleman is an artist, AI researcher, and educator. She makes art with AI and teaches others how to do it. Lia teaches machine learning art at the Rhode Island School of Design. Her writing on AI and new media art has been published by the Princeton Architectural Press and Neocha magazine. Leo holds a BSc in computer science from MIT and is an alumnus of the School for Poetic Computation in New York.
Thanks so much, Martin. Yeah, that was a great introduction. Lee and I are both really excited to be here. So yeah, this is sort of set up as a workshop. You're welcome, if you did install Runway, you're welcome to follow along. We'll talk about the pricing when we get into Runway. But yeah, you get, I think, $15 and 15 USD in free credits. So, you know, you will go through a little bit of that, hopefully not all of it today. But yeah, just be aware of that. And then, yeah, we'll also talk a little bit about what machine learning is and how it's applied to art. Yeah, so I think it'll be fun, but definitely please drop us questions in the chat, especially if you get lost as we go through the workshop.
Well, yeah, thank you guys
Anything
all
else?
for being here today.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and start sharing the screen. Yeah, so this talk is on generating artwork and visual assets with machine learning. So, like for example, you might have, if like while you're creating games, you might want to create like a background, or maybe you're just curious about, yeah, about just generating images and videos with AI. So we'll start off with like just some intros.
Cool. Yeah. So my name's Derrick Schultz, and Martin introduced me already, so I won't go too deep into that. I'm a designer and artist working out of Brooklyn, New York. And so a lot of my work does explore sort of using data sets that are sort of pre-modern, I guess maybe you could say, using a lot of vintage botanical and other scientific illustration. And my work was, I do a lot of illustration work for various magazines and publications. So I believe late last year I did some work for the New York Times. We can post links to this work, but it's also animated. So in the paper itself, it was all static artwork, but all of them were animations. And we'll look at maybe, I don't know if we'll look at animations today. We'll look at a little bit of animation today, but yeah. And then recently, like I've started doing a lot more of work in sort of abstract filmmaking. Um, I'm really inspired by sort of again sort of earlier artists who were exploring sort of the early days of cinema, and that sort of is I think of myself as exploring the early days of machine learning. So yeah, so that's my work. I posted links to my Instagram and Twitter account if you want to follow me or find more of my work there. But yeah, so I started artificial images about almost 2 years ago now, and the whole idea was just to like make some of this stuff more accessible to, um, artists, filmmakers, game designers, those sort of things, because I think there's a lot of potential value in this, but until we really have artists exploring and making stuff with this, we don't really know the full potential, and we also um, can't have all the cool tools we need. So I'm really excited to show you Runway today because I think it's one of the first really helpful tools to make this stuff more accessible.
Yeah, and like adding off of what Derek just said about like making machine learning more accessible, I think like for me one of the most rewarding parts of teaching these classes is like seeing what all our students make because they all come from very different backgrounds and then giving them like this tool of machine learning and being like go make stuff is really really cool. So we're really glad to like present you guys sort of your first foray into machine learning and like excited to see what you guys make. So I'm Lia Coleman. Here are links to my website, my Instagram, and my Twitter to follow my work. Recently, I've been doing sound reactive visualizations, so I'll go ahead and play this. Skip a little bit forward. Yeah, and so yeah, the beautiful cello music is from my friend Nathan Chan. But yeah, I'm basically integrating visuals generated by StyleGAN with Touch Designer to make these like sound reactive stuff. I also recently made with a couple friends like a zine, a digital zine on how to make AI art responsibly. So sort of going through the steps of, you need a data set, you need some code, you need GPUs, and also like a plan for like how you're going to publish it, and just sort of interrogating like what are things I should be thinking about when I'm like scraping a lot of images, or maybe using very resource intensive GPUs, and what is their effect on the environment. And that's linked here if you guys want to check that out too. Yeah, and with that said, with our introductions over, I'm gonna do a quick little primer on Machine Learning 101. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions as they come up in the chat. So this guy is, I guess, yeah. Can you put in the chat who this guy is? Who is this guy? Does he look familiar? Yeah, yeah, the evil guy from Terminator. Yeah, so this evil guy from the Terminator, like scary robot from the future, is what a lot of people think about when they think about AI. Oh, robots are going to take over the world. And one thing that we really want to impress is that there are two types of AI. There's general AI and narrow AI. General AI are things like the Terminator, these crazy robots, supercomputers, and yeah, this is all the stuff of science fiction. Like this is not here yet. Like it's very far off. The AI that does exist today is called narrow AI. And the reason why it's called narrow AI is because its scope is really, really, really narrow. And it can only do one thing, or it's only trained to do one thing, but it is trained to do that one thing really well. And then outside of that very narrow scope, um, it, yeah, we don't know, or wasn't meant to function in those domains. So it might like act strangely. So this is an example that we like to use. This is this model called StyleGAN, and essentially all it does is it turns images of horses to images of zebras, and vice versa. So you give it a zebra, it turns into a horse. You give it a horse, it turns into a zebra. That's like all it was trained to do. And if you give it like something else, like it wasn't trained to do that, so like it will not be helpful to you in some other function or some other domain. Like this is all it does is horses to zebras and zebras to horses. So yeah, the current state of AI today is like not like at the level that we need to like, or at least in my opinion, that we need to like be afraid of the Terminator or anything like that. The current level is like very, very narrow scope. We can do this one very narrow task really well, but outside of that, like, who knows? Yeah, and with that, does like anybody have any questions? And if not, Derek, you can feel free to hop in and introduce Runway.
I should also add that if I promised I wouldn't post any horror imagery in this demo, but if you want to, you can look up Vladimir Putin horse to zebra, and you'll see what happens if you give the horse to zebra model a non-horse image, or like an image that has a horse and a human in it. Google that at your own peril. It's not like completely not safe for work, but it's definitely a little weird. So yeah, so today we're going to show you Runway. Runway is a tool that started about 2 years ago. It was started by some folks here in New York. That it actually started as a thesis project at ITP, if you're familiar with that program, and it became an app, and they've now raised some money and are building this out as a tool for pretty much anyone to use. So we'll go to the next. So Runway is sort of known as like the Photoshop for machine learning. That's probably both an exaggeration and also like a little bit limiting to think about. But the idea is that there's sort of a GUI interface, which has always been one of the challenges for machine learning. There has always been a lot of code or a lot of installation process and those sort of things. And Runway really does a great job of sort of removing that. It removes, a lot of hurdles to getting access to machine learning. Like, you don't have to own your own GPU. You don't have to rent servers from Google or AWS. And it also removes a lot of that hindrance of like having to run the command line or other things. So it just offers a GUI, a way for you to sort of interact with machine learning models and start to get a familiarity and a comfort with sort of how they work without having to set up a whole like tech infrastructure. And they've also like been very slowly rolling out new interface changes and improvements that allow for a lot of new functionality. There's honestly stuff that you can do in Runway that's actually really, really hard to do purely through your own servers and those sort of things. So we won't look at everything today, but we will look at a couple of the cool interfaces that are available to you through Runway. And as mentioned, there is a price to Runway. Runway is not free. So we'll look a little bit at this as we actually run some models in our workshop demo. But it's essentially 5 cents per minute for testing, which is mostly what we're going to do in this session. So I believe you're given $15 when you sign up for an account. So again, I don't think you'll run through all of that today, but just be aware that there is sort of a price to this stuff. Runway also has a subscription model, so I believe it's $15 a month or $144 a year. That's obviously all in USD. I don't know what that converts to wherever you are. And that gives you access to training. We won't cover training in this workshop, but I'll talk about it briefly when we talk about StyleGAN. So that unlocks training for you, but then there's also a price to that as well, which is half a cent per step. So if you're interested more in training after you see some of the StyleGAN demos we do, we have a bunch of videos on our YouTube page that we'll share at the end that talk about training and how to do it.
Yeah, so in today's workshop, I'll be demoing one model and then Derrick will be demoing the other. And yeah, as we said, feel free to follow along, and I'll make sure to go like step by step slowly so you guys can follow along as you watch. Or also feel free to just listen in and do it in your own time afterwards. So the first model that I'll be demoing today is SPADE. So what SPADE does is it takes an image and then translates it to another image. When thinking about machine learning models, it's generally really helpful to think about inputs and outputs. So in this case, like this might be the input image, which just kind of looks like a bunch of colorful shapes. And then the output, after you pass it through the SPADE model, will be this. Like you have an apple and an orange and a carrot and this floating slice of pizza. But what is happening here is like each color is corresponding to a specific texture. Like this hot pink is the pizza texture, and this brown is the apple texture. And so SPADE Cocoa is one particular model of SPADE that's trained on household objects, so things like pizza and apples and oranges. And here's another one that I did yesterday. It's a little funny. This is a human texture, and I drew a stick man. And yeah, what this input image is called when it has these colors that correspond to specific like specific textures is a segmentation map. It's essentially just like everything that's purple, I want you to make a bicycle texture. And yeah, and then what the model does is tries to translate it into a photorealistic image. And so SPADE is like a particular model, and it can be trained on different data sets. So SPADE Cocoa is a specific data set that is of like pizza and apples, but you can also train it on landscapes. So they also have this model available in Runway where, you know, this brown corresponds to a tree. These are some clouds that I doodled yesterday, some grass and water, and this is the output, which is, you know, not great, but yeah, it's kind of interesting to see like this is where machine learning is today when it comes to translating, you know, these doodles to photorealistic images. Yeah, so with that, if you are following along, go to app.runwayml.com and we can go ahead and check out Runway's interface. So I will go ahead and go to app.runwayml.com. And yeah, if you've already created an account, you'll come to this screen. This is the landing page for Runway ML. They have this interface that you land on where they have sort of highlighted these main tools that they're prioritizing. But what we're really interested in for this workshop are browse models, the models. So you can also click here or this models here on the side tab. And I'll go ahead and click through to models. Yeah, just making sure everybody has time when they're following along. So if you click the models on the side tab, you'll come to this screen, which has a bunch of categories for sort of collating all the different machine learning models. So there's video post-processing, like if you want to generate a depth map from a video or an image. There's stylization, which contains a lot of models called style transfer, which you might have heard of before, where it takes like an image and then maybe, you know, makes it look like in the style of Starry Night, for example. And they have animation and some other models that we'll link to later in the presentation as well. What we're going to look at today, the SPADE model, is in this experimental category. So let's go ahead and click through to experimental. I think experimental is where they've sort of pushed, I don't know, like the mishmash mixed bag of models that didn't really fit in other categories. But here's the SPADE model. Here, Runway has called it sketches to images because I think sketches to images is a lot more human readable than just SPADE. SPADE is the name of the model when it was released through a paper. If we click through, that takes us to this information page of the model. And this sort of gives us more information if we want to, like this is the abstract from the original paper, generate realistic images from sketches and doodles. And the title of the actual paper is Semantic Image Synthesis with Spatially Adaptive Normalization, trained on Cocoa Stuff dataset. And then in the first line it says, for synthesizing photorealistic images given an input semantic layout. So this is sort of, I don't know, machine learning research, data science speak from the original paper, but essentially it takes semantic layout like that colorful blobby image to synthesize photorealistic images. And yeah, this info page is generally useful. It has a link to the GitHub repo. And then to actually go ahead and use this model, you click Add to Workspace up here. And you can add it to a new workspace. And Runway will autofill you with kind of silly, strange workspace models, or workspace names. I'll just go ahead and rename this to like SPADE Cocoa, or you can feel free to keep theirs and click Create. And this is the user interface for actually running a model. the way it's set up is up here on the top. There, that's your input, and then your output will come down here. So the input to Spade Cocoa are those like really colorful doodle things. So Runway has a UI. If you click segmentation up here, segmentation, and this is sort of like a kind of like an MS Paint kind of thing, where here you have a brush size, and you can pick, I want to draw a train, and try to draw a train. So yeah, feel free to follow along and make your own doodles. Draw a train. And so each of these colors corresponds to a specific thing that we're trying to draw. Draw a bird. And sometimes you can get like strange results if you like use a texture that's not meant for the shape you drew. Like, I don't know, maybe I'll draw a pizza in the shape of a chair. Okay, and yeah, there's a lot of different images you can, or a lot of different textures you can use. And this purple button right here, Run Model, that's how you actually run your model. And once you click this, it'll spin up a GPU, a server on Runway's side, and render your segmentation out to this image. So here's what we got. Yeah, I think the default background is the sky. So it looks like, yeah, we have like this floating pizza chair and a train in the sky. And one important thing is when you click Run Model, that is when you actually start getting charged the credits that Derrick mentioned earlier. And yeah, when you're done, let me add something. When you click Run Model, after it's done, it'll tell you how long it took to perform inference, which is the translation. And then I usually always click Stop just to make sure that I'm not being charged anymore. And to download this, you can click this download to save the image, and it'll save it locally. And yeah, that is about it for Spade Cocoa. And yeah, I hope you have a fun time like creating these sort of, I wouldn't call them horror, but they are kind of like a little weird images of segmentation as Spade Cocoa.
Yeah, one thing to add is if you do have, you know, obviously the paint tools in this are a little horsey, I guess. I don't know if that's a term that everyone uses, but just a little clunky. You can also do this directly in Photoshop, and then you could save out the image and you could import the image. I believe there's a way to import it as a file instead of as a segmentation map. So yeah, you can always save out the image in another tool with a little bit more of a, you know, fine-grained control, and then you can import it that way. Yeah, so go for it, Leah.
Oh yeah, I see a question. If I run the model longer, would it change the result? So with this model, no. So this is just performing inference, so it's like a one-to-one type of thing. Like as soon as you run it, like you get what you get, and then that's it.
Yeah, there are some models that do, the longer you run them, it happens less in Runway because of how Runway is built, but there are models where sometimes if you do run things longer, you will get different results. But Spade is not one of those.
Yeah, yeah. So that's it for Spade Cocoa, and I'll let Derrick take over for the second demo.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about StyleGAN. So StyleGAN is probably one of the more popular or more well-known machine learning models. You've probably seen a lot of morphing faces and those sort of things, and that was done using StyleGAN. StyleGAN operates a little bit differently than, say, SPADE does, where SPADE is you sort of give it an image and it gives you a translated image back. StyleGAN actually works with the concept of vectors, which can be a little hard to explain. So before I jump into StyleGAN, I'm going to explain vectors to you. So you might have thought of vectors as like Illustrator or like a vector art type of thing. A vector is really just a point in space. So when we think about StyleGAN, it's important to think about all these points in a two-dimensional space for now, and that when you pick a point out, let's say you pick out this point, you'll get something back to you that is an image. So in this example, it happens to be faces. So when I pick this point, I get this face back. When you pick a point that's far away in space, you get a very different face back. So in this case, I picked this face, and you'll see this person happens to have more facial hair, more something like a hairnet or hat, but it's drastically different than this person. When you pick a point in space that is closer, you actually get a face that is more like the other face in space, right? So you know, these two faces are fairly similar. It looks like maybe hair length, maybe a little bit of skin tone changes. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is that the closer you are in this space, the more likely your images are to be the same. And what's cool about something like this interface, where you basically just have points in space, is you can start to do animations relatively easily from them. So if you take a point in space and you move along that point to end up at a different space, what you end up with is an animation. Did I get an animation? Maybe I didn't. Okay. You should get an animation. We'll look at that in a minute. But yeah, so this is one of the cool properties of sort of these mathematic spaces, is that you can move along them and it generates what we call interpolations. It looks like an animation, it looks like morphing, those sort of things. The challenge here is I've talked about this all in two-dimensional spaces, and StyleGAN is actually 512 dimensions, which our brains can't really wrap our heads around. So just think it's like 3D with way, way, way more spaces. So we're going to look at one particular model of StyleGAN in Runway, but there are many, many, many of them. So let me jump over to Runway. So like Lia mentioned, when you're on the home screen, there's the Browse Model interface, and there's the models over here. I usually just click on the models here on the left-hand side. And the categories we're sort of looking for, so there's two categories you could look at for StyleGAN models. One is latent videos. So that space that I talked about, where you have lots of points and images at each point, is called a latent space. So if you see the word latent, that usually means there's some space that you can navigate or create animations from. So there's the latent videos. There's also the community section. So as I mentioned earlier, you can train your own StyleGAN model inside of Runway. We won't cover that today. But if you're interested, we do have a bunch of demo videos on how to do that. So the community section also tends to have a lot of StyleGAN models in it. These are mostly models trained by the community. I'm going to click into latent videos, and we're going to look at some of our options here. So as I mentioned, there are quite a lot of StyleGAN models in here. So you've got coral, reefs, fish, a Pokemon generator, textures, fashion illustrations, tattoos, pizza. Pizza happens to be a very popular thing amongst machine learning crowd. I wonder why. So there's also like a brutalist architecture generator. There are many, many, many StyleGAN models. In addition to being able to train your own, there's also a Simpsons model. Again, I won't do anything horrific, so we'll skip that one. I think what we're going to play with is we're going to play with the sky generator. In part because this one has what I describe as a lot of diversity, which means a lot of the images can be like, you can get a lot of different images out of it. So just as Lia showed, we're going to add this to our workspace. And let's call this Sky StyleGAN. So when you look at the input here, there's a couple of things to know. First off is along the right-hand side, there's two different models to pick from. There's SkyGAN 3000 and SkyGAN 4000. Usually that means how long the model is trained for. So 3000 is probably 3000 steps, 4000 is probably 4000 steps. 4000 is probably means it's just a little bit of a better model. So let's pick that. And then we're going to switch our input to vector. So as I mentioned, these are all vector spaces. Runway has a really cool interface that allows you to sort of explore these vectors in really a nice way. So we'll go ahead and select that, and then we're going to run our model. So again, when you click Run Model, you're going to start to be charged for the time you spend. I do find that, especially with StyleGAN models, you can spend a lot of time just exploring the interface. So we'll look at how to do that. These models do take a little bit longer to get set up and run, just because they're behind the scenes setting up a server and installing a bunch of code and things. So it usually takes, you know, a minute or two for this model to start up. Cool. So now that we're running here, you'll see that the vector is a series of grids, or a grid, and in there is a series of different images. So the way this model works, I'm going to make my screen here a little bit bigger, is that you can sort of pan around and it will generate new images. And the idea is that as you move in a certain direction, you'll see more of the same image, or more like variations on a similar image. So you'll see here we got a lot of orange sky with sort of these stripes in the sky. And if I move down here, I probably will see, you know, more images like this. So you can control this a little bit more with sampling distance. So sampling distance says, you know, how much variation should I see within the grid. So you could make this really small, like if you made this a 0.2, you'll see it's almost, you know, entirely the same image with very subtle variations. And if I made this, let's say I make this 1.0, I should get a lot more variation. And especially as I pan around, I'll see, you know, different things appear on the grid. The truncation value, which is also here, relates to sort of how, Young, I'm using the web app. I don't know if you have the desktop app, but the web app should just be the latest version of everything. But yeah, so usually I tend to use the web app these days. So truncation is a concept within the StyleGAN model that says, how realistic do I want my images to be? So if I make my truncation value a little bit smaller, like let's make it 0.2, what I should get is less diversity, meaning less change, but something that appears more like a real sky. Skies might be a little bit hard because they're fairly abstract. If you were to do this with, say, buildings or something else, what you would see is the smaller your truncation value is, the more realistic the building looks, but the less diversity you have. Whereas if you set this to, again, let's try 1.0, you'll see, you know, skies that I guess almost look like they have volcanoes in them, or you know, just a lot more diversity. So playing with both truncation and sampling distance can get you a lot of variation within various models. So there's a lot you can do within this. So if you're interested in actually seeing what the mathematic value of a model is, or of a particular image is, you can go ahead and click on the image and then come over here and hit Save Vector. This will create a JSON file, which you can then open in, say, let's say we'll open it in a code editor. And it's nothing that a human could read, right? This is a 512 dimensional vector. Let me see, word wrap. So it's a lot of numbers. That's all that really matters. You can also save out your images. So in addition to saving the vector, you can come over here and click Save Image, and that will save your image to your desktop computer. So you could go around here and you can just click on a bunch of images and save them out. Now, let's say you wanted to actually create an animation with this. So say you wanted to go from, you know, one of these really bright red skies to one of these more bluish skies. The way to do that is actually through the Export tab. It's a little buried here, but if you go ahead and click Export, you'll see that you've got two options here. You've got Generate Latent Walk Video or Generate Images. So if you wanted to batch export, like say 500 images or something, you could do that through the Generate Images tab. We're going to play with the Latent Walk Video editor. I should also mention that pricing is slightly different for these exports. It tends to be a little bit cheaper. So when you're actually playing with that interface, it's 5 cents a minute. These are a batch process, so they tend to be a little bit less expensive. So I think when you do generate images, it tends to be about 1 cent per image, maybe lower. Don't quote me on that, but it will give you sort of the amount, the value that actually is available to you. So we'll see here, this is loading a little bit slow. Cool. So this is a really, really powerful tool. They just added this, like, I guess maybe a couple months ago, but it's really fun to play with. I often find myself, even though like I could do this in many other tools, I still find myself using this directly in Runway. So the way this works is you can pick a couple different images. So you can go ahead and add another point. So let's say we're going from blue to this pinkish color to, now I can sort of dig around, and let's say I want to go from this. This almost looks like a celestial body almost. So I'll actually delete these. So I'm going to go from this point to this point to this point, and then you get to set how long you want it to go for. I'll set this for 5 seconds. I don't want this demo to take too long to generate these videos. And you've got some easing methods. If you're an animator, you probably are familiar with what these easing tools allow you to do. So once you've got sort of your points set up here, and you can play with things, I'm doing a quick demo here, but there's a lot more time you could spend sort of playing with these various points. We can actually add, let's add a couple more in here. So we'll add this one, and we will add this one. And a cool little trick here, which is a little tricky because I don't know where this image came from, is if you start and stop the exact same image, you can actually create a loop. So let's actually see if we can do this. So I'm going to see if I can drag this. Don't know if I actually can do dragging here. Let's see. Well, let's actually change this. So we'll change this to this image. So it's this one. Whoops. Too much dragging. Let's go back to our model workspace. Oh no. Trying the live demo gods here a little bit. Okay, so let's try this again one more time. So let's set this first image as do this one, and then we'll add a couple more here at the end. And let's stop with the very last one. So again, we start and stop with the exact same image, and that's going to create a loop. And I'm going to set these all to 5 seconds. You'll see here above, there is sort of like you sort of get a visual view of how this actually works. And then you can come over here and you can press export. So you can set the video frame rate. I'm a bit of a stickler. I always do 24. You set the truncation value. One thing to note is that if you change these values after you've set your points, they'll actually be a little different. So this is a bit of a challenge here. So because I've already added my images, I'm not going to change this. And then you can come over here and you can hit cost. So one thing I definitely recommend is if you are a little cost conscious, make sure you check on the estimated cost here. So it says it's going to cost me 50 cents. So this is actually the minimum. If you use export, there's a minimum pricing. If I were to add way more, if I were to make like a 5-minute long video, I think this would be a lower price for the amount of time that we're doing. So at this point, you can go ahead and click export video. And when you do this, it's actually going to start to export the video behind the scenes. So Diego asked if we can use this with our own images. So if you want to do this with your own images, you're going to need to do a thing called training. Training is a different process. One of the challenges with training is that you'll need lots of images. They usually recommend about 500 to 1,000 images of a similar category. So 500 sky images, 500 face images, those sort of things. There are some other ways to use your own images in a StyleGAN model that are probably a little tricky to do inside Runway, but there are more opportunities. I tend to find that for a lot of my students, we'll spend a couple days or a couple weeks in a day, 1 class per week sort of setting, that we'll spend 2 to 3 weeks in Runway, and then people get really excited about it and they want to move outside of Runway. And there are lots of potential ways to do that. But it's usually helpful to start Runway and then sort of realize what your constraints are, and then you can start to figure out how to go outside of that. So it looks like this is still sort of running and setting up our process here. So basically what happens is when this is finished, I'll get a file that I can then download. So you'll be able to download a file. So in the meantime, I think let's talk a little bit about some other cool models inside of Runway. This sort of wraps up our demos, but we wanted to highlight some other models in here. Yeah, so Young mentions a good point, which is that you know, if you're a Mac user, you can't really do this on your own because we don't have a GPU that uses this. So Runway is a nice tool because it gives you all that, and it's only, you know, its cost is per minute rather than having to spend $5,000 on a GPU that could run this stuff. So there are like we showed a demo of 2 models. There's probably some like 80 to 100 models inside Runway, and that's not including the various like configurations of StyleGAN. So there are lots of other great models to check out. Leah, do you want to talk about this one real quick?
This is a model in Runway. It's called Style to Paint. And they're also, their little tagline for it is automatic sketch colorization. So this could be useful, like, I don't know, if you're a concept artist or you have a lot of sketches that you want to just quickly color and not have to color them manually. You input sort of a black and white image or a sketch, and then it will output a colorized image.
Cool. And recently, Runway has added these green screen features. So I don't know who in here is an animator. If you've ever done rotoscoping, you know how much of a pain in the ass it is. They have made a machine learning tool that like dramatically decreases the time to do rotoscoping. It's actually really, really great. I highly recommend it if you're interested in animation. And lastly, like if you're also an animator and you're interested in sort of like face modeling or body modeling, there are lots of cool body motion and face motion models. Again, we didn't really cover them in this because they take a little bit of time to get set up, but you can animate faces like almost like a puppet. You can animate bodies like a puppet. There's some cool things to play with. You know, like with most machine learning models, some of them work well, some of them don't. But I definitely recommend that you check those out. And lastly, we mentioned I have a YouTube channel that has a ton of other Runway tutorials, a ton of other machine learning art tutorials and other things. So if you are interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out this channel. There should be a lot of content in there. Leah and I do in-person classes. They're usually 5 to 10 weeks long, and you can find those through our various social media accounts. But I definitely would love to see what people make, so please share them with Leah and I, as well as the Tinderbox folks. So if you make some cool, let us check them out. Real quick, I just want to see if my video here is done. It looks like it is. So I'm just going to download this and we'll see what we ended up getting. Cool, and there we go. So we have an animated sky. Not too bad for a 5-minute demo. Cool. So with that, I think we will take any questions folks have.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. Let me get myself up here. Thanks so much. Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions, please add them to the chat and I'll direct them at Derrick and Leah. I've got a few, so I'll start off. I'm not a gamer or from the game. I don't make games either, but from my understanding is that I think that a lot more of image making stuff happens using vectors and not pixel-based stuff. Maybe that's wrong. Please correct me if that's not the case. So I was kind of wondering, all the mathematics that runs this stuff is mostly based about pixel manipulation. Is that right? Do you know if there are like any that do vector stuff anymore?
Yeah, my guess would be that there are lots of studios already invested in this work and looking at that, and we may not be able to see those just yet, right? A lot of this stuff is proprietary work or those sort of things. One of the biggest players in the machine learning space is NVIDIA, who obviously do graphic cards, but also work a lot with gaming studios. So yeah, it's I'm sure there's lots of work going on behind the scenes, and maybe they're just not public yet. But I would assume you'll see a lot of this work become fairly common in tools and those sort of things. I think Unity has some machine learning tools. I think Unity also has a plugin that connects to Runway. So there's probably also ways to integrate these things. And it's early days. Like I think we're really only seeing this stuff hit production in maybe the past 2 or 3 years. So we'll see a lot more happen soon.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I did see a model recently where someone trained, they trained it to output vector paths, and yeah, I'll go ahead and find it and then drop it in the chat. But essentially, like they trained it to draw sort of really minimalist line drawings and faces, but they constrained it so that it would only draw vector paths.
Cool. So Diego's asking, can I choose the resolution in the video examples?
So the resolution is dependent based on the model. So some models are trained at 512 by 512, some are 1024 by 1024. There are additional models called super resolution models that allow you to scale up the pixels and actually do more than just like bilinear interpolation, but actually create new texture as you scale them up. So there are some of those in Runway. There's also a company called Topaz Labs that is like heavily invested in making more video and photography tools using machine learning. So once you get into this space, you find that there's lots of tools to play with, and it's all about figuring out what works well for you and your use case.
Yeah, Chris is asking, I've wondered about using Runway to turn video moving figures into what look like animated brushstrokes. Would the green screen model or others be capable of doing something like that?
Yeah, hey Chris. Chris is a former student of mine. So partially, I mean, I think green screen helps for stuff like rotoscoping, and I've seen a lot of great examples where people sort of match that with style transfer. So I'm almost like, I would imagine you would almost do some like style transfer to get brush strokes onto your images, and then you could manipulate that using the rotoscoping or other tools in After Effects or other things to sort of get different layers. The truth is a lot of this stuff is like new, and part of the reason why Lia and I love teaching these classes is that no one's thought or played with these ideas yet. And until we get artists more involved in this scene, we won't really get these tools yet. So I would definitely recommend playing around a little bit. I should also mention, like, we have a Slack channel, so if you ever have questions about this sort of stuff, please feel free to join us there and drop in questions or drop in ideas. There's lots of other artists playing with other things who might also have ideas, or there might even be a machine learning researcher lurking and would be willing to help you out. I can't promise that one, but I do know that there are some machine learning people lurking in there who might be able to point you in the right direction of models that already exist.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, so if people want to move, maybe like dig a bit deeper into the code and move beyond Runway, you guys use Google Colab a lot. I wonder if you could speak briefly about what that is and how that's like an easy way to maybe dig in a bit deeper.
Yeah, so Google Colab, it allows you to take advantage of Google's GPUs, like they rent you cloud GPUs. It's generally the most cost-effective option as like an entry if you don't want to like go rent a server off of like AWS or Paperspace. But essentially, the way it's laid out is they're called Colab notebooks. And if you use the Python notebook, it's pretty similar or essentially the same, where you have these cells of code that you run. And essentially, like if you see like a model in the wild and you're like, I want to like take advantage of that, usually your first foray is like taking that GitHub repo and like importing it into a Google Colab notebook and then running through the cells. And what Colab gives you is sort of more freedom than Runway, because with Runway you're dealing with their UI and like the way they set things up. But it does obviously come with like debugging and yeah, being a little more code savvy.
Yeah, looks like there's a discussion going on about audio. Jung is asking if there's a platform for audio, and Chris is jumping in there as well. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tools that exist for audio are like maybe a year or two behind Runway, so they exist, but they're probably not as robust. Colab is a great place if you're interested in playing with audio models, because it's a little bit more open and free to work with that. Yeah, and Wekinator I think is another cool tool that works with some audio stuff, and it's a little bit more performance based, so you can play with a lot of these things and see what else is out there. But yeah, it's an emerging space of tools on top of AI models, and I think we'll see a lot more in the coming years.
Yeah, and adding on to audio, yeah, the space of like generative AI music is like kind of growing. I think OpenAI released a model called Jukebox about, I don't know, several months ago. Google also has a lab called Magenta where they focus on like art and music, but mostly generative music. And so they have a couple of projects that you can check out where you can like generate music. And there are also associated Colab notebooks if you want to actually like run the code yourself.
Yeah. Jack is asking, he says, I'm completely new to this, but mainly I come across this through stories around fake news and I guess more malicious uses of what seems like similar kinds of technology. Where should I look to find more creative examples or interesting uses of this? Are any good examples of other creative projects around this? Feel free to
Uh,
direct your own work here.
yeah, I mean, I would definitely say following Leah and I is a great way to sort of get to find out about some of this work. There's a really cool project, I believe it's called ML by Art, so MLX Art. Is that right, Leah? From one of the someone who works at a Google studio in
Yeah,
Europe, and they have created a whole collection of really cool projects. Um, if we find that link, we can drop it in there really quick. Yes, perfect, awesome.
yeah, just
Um, so that's cool. The other cool thing is, so Leah was a part of a workshop called NeurIPS, and NeurIPS every year is both a workshop for machine learning researchers and scientists, but they also usually have like an art workshop every year. So they accept new works and they sort of they have a jury that selects the best work and those sort of things. I was in it this year, but there's also like a bunch of other pieces that are really cool to check out. So I would say like between those resources, you're probably getting like the best of the best. But I feel like I always see new things that pop up every now and then on Twitter or other places. So yeah, it's definitely an emerging space, and I think we'll see more and more stuff as well.
I think someone just
Mhm.
dropped in the Serpentine creative AI lab as well, which is really good. I was also going to say, suggest that Leah, you've also done a lot of work, and you did the design, the Xenon stuff on
Yeah.
actual like ethical practice within making art as well. So maybe that's something you could touch on.
Mhm. Oh yeah, yeah. I was working with a former student actually, who sort of researches the ethics of AI and the societal implications. We're actually giving a workshop in 2 weeks at Mozilla Festival talking about that. Um, yeah, and I think Mozilla Festival is free, so you can feel free to like check that out and attend that. But yeah, essentially thinking about like for training your own model, you often have to like have a lot of data, and often like sometimes you're like taking data from the internet and scraping it. And so things to think about are like, are there people in your data set? How do you feel if you were in someone else's data set? And thinking about ownership and copyright. And also, yeah, like your relationship with companies like NVIDIA and Google. Um, yeah, I think I heard recently, and Derek, feel free to like chime in on this. I think I heard recently that Google might be partnering with something related to like a Department of Defense. And so, yeah, basically like think about the implications of like the companies that you're supporting and working with and using their tools. Also, training is not is very energy intensive and it's not like super great for the environment. And yeah, you might have heard more of this discussion with crypto art and like how it's sort of like very energy intensive and not great for the environment, but also, yeah, training is also not that great. Um, but essentially, um, yeah, the zine is laid out as sort of like guiding questions to ask yourself because this is a very, very new field and there's not a lot of like black and white answers to like do this, don't do this, but just like things to keep in mind while you're creating work like this.
Yeah. I'll see if there's, I think we're just over time now, but maybe one more question. Have you ever used AIs built in game engines like Unity to create audio through, or maybe that might have been to Young actually, who previously mentioned she was working with Max MSP. I don't know. Do you guys have any experience with like Unity or game engines?
I started touching a little bit, or like exploring or sort of like testing the waters with machine learning models in Unity. Unity has a thing called Barracuda where you can import models. Um, yeah, it does support GANs if you're trying to generate stuff, but it does need to be in a specific format. It's called like Onyx format, ONNX format. But yeah, haven't yet explored all of that just yet.
Cool. All right. I think we're going to have to wrap it up now, but thank you so much, Derrick and Lia. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Everyone should check out the rest of the program. We've still got 4 more days of 4 more days. Yeah, 4 more days of events. Yeah, so go and check out the program. I also need to thank Creative Informatics who sponsored this arm of the program, the Creative Tech events from this. I don't know if there's anything else to say. Jack, do you have anything you want to chime in with?
No, just to say a huge thanks to Derrick and Lia. And I don't know if you're up for just unmuting yourselves and giving them a round of applause and saying thanks a lot for coming to share all of that amazing work and new ideas. It's a completely new area for me, but it's totally fascinating to get a glimpse into it. So a huge thanks from us and from Tinderbox Playway. Yeah, quick round of applause for Derrick and Lia.
Yes. Thank you.